So it's been over 3 months since Hurricane Helene left a path of devastation and destruction across multiple states in the southeast. Category 4 storm, 140 miles per hour of wind, 400 miles stretch of land absolutely affected by it. 30 inches of rain in North Carolina, 15-foot storm surges in Florida, 20 reported tornadoes across 5 different states. There were billions of dollars in damages, complete upheaval of people's lives. There have been widespread complaints about the federal response to Helene's victims' needs. But amidst all of that devastation, right, there have been huge outpourings of charity, volunteerism, stories of hope that can be lessons for those who are looking for ways to serve others, challenges for those who have become a bit too comfortable sitting on the sidelines. So how can we take this recovery effort and use it to promote flourishing in the lives of even more people? Let's get intrinsically motivated. All right, so let's do something a little bit different. Up to this point, in case you are new to the podcast, a lot of what we've been doing with Intrinsically Motivated has been looking at the stories of different individuals, hearing how people have faced challenges in recovery and the ways that different people around them or different services came around them and really helped them, find healing and hope and these sorts of things. Or we've talked to different experts in different parts of the field of recovery and ask them questions about, what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our minds, what's going on in the medical field, how we're addressing and treating addiction. And we've really been trying to, up to this point, figure out what is it that we can learn? How can we glean some of this information to kind of focus it into what we at Uplift Appalachia are trying to do, which is to replace addiction and mental health challenges with flourishing. And so up to this point, we really have just been learning as much as we can, but now we also want to try to take what we've learned and turn that into a bit more of an imperative. We want to take the things that we've heard, the lessons that we've learned, the what has worked, the what has not worked, and really turn that into more of a call to action, not only for ourselves, but for the church around us, because that's really who we're trying to reach. We're trying to talk to the church directly and say, there is more that we can be doing. There is an effort that can be made beyond just what we have seen happening up to this point, or set aside kind of to the side saying there are other people that are handling problems of like addiction and mental health problems. And so how can we as the church step up? That's been our whole focus since we became an organization now over 3 years, 4 years, however long it's been. It's been a long time. We've been at this for a bit now. But we want to take a look at not just what we can do, but actually call ourselves to do it. Not just say, here's the problem and just learn about the problem, right? There was a great story years ago that I remember Francis Chan talking about. It's one thing for my dad to say, go clean your room. Was the example that he would use. And I'd say, well, let me do a study about what the words clean my room actually mean, when really what my dad is telling me to do is actually go clean my room. So if we are called to love people and serve people, and there's a huge need for people in recovery, how can we actually respond in a meaningful way and actually do something, not just study about what it would look like or what the actual call looks like? So when we do our trainings as an organization, we always start with trauma-informed care training. And we start with that because it's such a foundational place for us to understand what's going on in our own lives and in the lives of people around us. And it really gives us a new way of seeing people and what's going on in their lives. And one of the examples that we use in that is the example of the iceberg. And so for this podcast, what we're really wanting to do is dive deep into that example of that iceberg, because the iceberg is what we see on top is what's actually going on, but there's so much below the surface that is why all of those actions or why those responses are taking place. And so what we want to do is look at individual topics or stories or news pieces or studies that come out and really try to say what is going on, and then step back and say, why is the response what it is, or why are the things happening the way that they are, so that we can then develop that intrinsic motivation, that phrase that we use all the time. Use that intrinsic motivation to really power ourselves into more effective ministry going forward. So let's get started with the what. So like I said, when we talk about trauma-informed care, the first half of our training really is the things that we see and what's going on. We don't really understand. It helps to reshape our understanding of why things are happening, but really we understand there are problems. And so using this example of Hurricane Helene, and we'll talk about why Helene connects so perfectly into what we're trying to do at Uplift with regards to responding to the addiction crisis that we're facing as a nation. I just want to kind of talk about what we're talking about here. When we talk about Helene, we are talking about something that had a huge financial impact. The total economic damage as of the recording of this was over $200 billion overall. That's $60 billion in North Carolina. That's $7 billion in Georgia, $4 billion in Tennessee, $50 billion in Florida. All of these are without even talking about the agricultural costs. This is just like actual infrastructure damages that were being caused. So this huge financial effect that this one storm over the course of a day left in this wake of its effect as it went through the whole Southeast. People losing power, people losing homes, people losing livelihoods, people losing the ability to go back to work because now they don't even have an ability to get from one place to another. So this huge impact. And we already talked about, we've mentioned the death toll. Over 230 people lost their lives as a result of the effects of Hurricane Helene. And there were more that were still missing. That number will, I'm sure, continue to change over time. But just absolute devastation. But the cool thing, if you can say the cool thing, when you're talking about something like this, to me, is seeing the response of people to the needs of those that were around them. Specifically, the response from the church. I've heard countless stories of people from different area churches where I live here in Johnson City, Tennessee, going out and doing all sorts of things, whether it was clearing trees, whether it was helping rebuild houses, whether it was taking meals. Over 500 churches helped with hurricane relief. They raised over $50 million, essentially overnight, especially if you're familiar with how the church tends to work. The church tends to work very slowly for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's because the churches are small and they don't have access to lots of resources, lots of people to really make things happen. Sometimes it's because churches are very big and they have lots of, decision-making processes and lots of procedures and people that have to kind of go through the decision-making process or voting or, making these statements in front of the church and getting approval, all of that. So churches traditionally move relatively slowly when they're trying to make decisions, but that really wasn't the case with Helene. Really quickly, and I mean, we're 3 months out now, and churches raised over $50 million. Samaritan's Purse, $20 million, Catholic Charities, $10 million, and there are countless other areas. 10,000 volunteers from churches were mobilized to assist with disaster aid. 1,500 homes received repairs, supplies. There were 500,000 emergency supply kits, including food, water, hygiene, that were immediately rushed into the areas where people were most affected. In the end, churches and faith-based organizations were involved in rescuing and providing shelter to over 10,000 individuals. And this is a really amazing thing that happened. And as we go forward, I don't want you to lose sight of what I'm trying to say. This is a really cool thing that I think can only happen within the church. Only the church can really equip itself to immediately go out and respond to people's needs. And honestly, only the church is really internally equipped to want to go do this. There's no financial gain in this. You're giving up your time. You're giving up your resources. You're giving up your comfort. And sometimes you're putting yourself in really difficult places where you're going to have hard conversations with people who have lost so much, and you don't know what they're going to say to you, how they might respond to your efforts to give them something. And it's just so cool to see the church living out as a community in the way that we are called to live as a community. I was looking through different stories of people talking about the ways that people were responding, and I came across this one article, this one story on the Daily Wire, where they were talking to folks from Roan Mountain who were saying, I'm going to have to leave. I can't live here anymore. I had no insurance for this. My house is completely gone. I'm going to have to move to another place where I have more family to support me. But then there were also people in that area who were able to step in. And I'll just read you a few pieces from this. It says, despite the grave situation, the residents of Roan Mountain have found themselves in. The community has rallied around a mutual concern for each other and an acute sense that lacking the resource of wealthier and more urban areas, they must look after themselves. One of the people they interviewed said, that's one of the things about people who live in the Appalachia region. A lot of them have tractors and excavators and skid steers and chainsaws. And there are guys that just, when there's a need, guys and gals go out there to work and to help. And then they said, this was always a close-knit community, but it's much closer-knit community since September 27th. It was people in this community with the resources they had, doing what they could in order to meet people's needs. And that's only going to come out of a heart to give something not expecting a return. That's going to be a natural outpouring of one's compassion and love and empathy for people that are around them. And this kind of response is exactly what would be required by the church if it was going to step out and try to overcome addiction as well. These two conversations work perfectly together, just for the fact that there's evidence that there is increased drug use even after natural disasters. After Hurricane Katrina, the amount of illicit drug use spiked in a noticeable way after people were displaced from their homes or had to leave their community entirely, or were left without the community resources that they had been accustomed to receiving, because the whole city was absolutely devastated in a similar way that we're talking about here with Hurricane Helene. But this is really about responding to a crisis because of an innate desire to see people cared for and to live lives of flourishing. It's not just that, hey, here's something that I can fix, I'm going to go fix it, but it's I want good for the people that are around me, the people that are in my own community, right? That's exactly what we were talking about with the folks in Roan Mountain, that they were saying, these are people in my community. They're not going to receive the relief, the help, the support from the people around, from the government or from the resources that I want. So I'm going to have to step out and I'm going to have to do something for them. And it's going to draw us closer together as we are helping people. We're being helped ourselves, and that we're growing closer together. We're seeing people's lives be put back together. We're seeing them, again, move toward lives of flourishing, not just stopping at, well, now I have a place to live, but rather we're going to get people back on their feet. And that's what we call intrinsic motivation. That's what we're talking about, that desire from within to do something good for people out of what has been done within us, the power of the Holy Spirit working in us, and that the church is uniquely equipped to be the ones to respond in this way. And this gets to the comparison that I really want us to use. And again, everything that happened with Hurricane Helene was absolutely tragic. So what I'm about to say as we start to connect this to relief efforts with regarding addiction, I don't want you to hear what I'm saying when I start comparing numbers and try to say he's making light of what's happened to people through this hurricane. People's lives were lost. They were absolutely devastated. And I don't want to diminish that for even a moment. This is a huge problem, right? We said Helene's death toll was over 230 people in one day because of one storm. And every single one of those deaths was a tragedy. But I just want to compare that to, just in the state of Tennessee, from 2018 to 2022, fatal overdose deaths rose by 230%. 230%, just to give you some perspective on what that is in context, because that could be moving from one person to three people. It's not moving from one person to three people. Nationwide, since 2019, people who died of drug-involved overdoses spiked from 70,630 people to over 107,900 people in 2022. And that's just talking about death numbers. If we're talking about actual just substance use disorder, according to SAMHSA, over 48.7 million people over the age of 12 suffer from substance use disorder. Just to give you that perspective, we're talking about this amazing response. We see what the church is capable of doing when they see this need, right? The need is people have been displaced, people have lost their lives, people have lost their property. We need to do something. And what I'm trying to say is, on a huge scale, we're seeing people die every single day because of addiction at a scale that is hard to fathom for people who have not been walking in the circles of the people who are in that recovery community, trying to help people who are trying to find their way out and trying to have their lives saved and trying to move their lives away from mental health challenges and substance abuse and toward flourishing. So if the church can be so immediately mobilized for this single event, how much more ought we be motivated for this ongoing crisis, right? We talk about, and if you come to any of our trauma-informed care trainings, we talk about acute events, things that happen one time, but then we also talk about chronic events. Hurricane Helene is this one acute event. Now, it's going to have some chronic effects along the way. There are going to be things that are ongoing that people are going to continue to deal with. But this one-off event has had this effect, and it's really driven people to work in a way that we haven't seen, on a scale that we haven't seen specifically from within the church, which is amazing. But then we have this chronic event on the other hand, that's been ongoing for years and years and years, and we've seen this steady increase in the tragedy and the effect of it year over year. It seemed like we were going to get a little bit better right around 2019. It's like, oh, we're turning the corner. These deaths are starting to taper off. And then we had this huge pandemic, and people got isolated from everybody else. They went back to their houses. There was no more connection. And all of a sudden, we see this spike from 70,000 to 107,000. Now, I don't want you to hear 70,000 people died and then 100,000 people died. We're talking 107,000 people die every year of overdose. Even if that number starts to come back down, we're still talking tens of thousands of people that are being affected. And these are just reported deaths, right? These are just the ones that we know about. That's just a percentage of the people that are actually in active addiction. And this is the point that when we do these talks and when we try to call the church to respond in a certain way, we're responding to it because we use these astronomical numbers because we think, wow, this is really going to open people's eyes and they're going to want to do something about it. And they're going to want to jump out and say, how can we as the church do something? It's time for us to do something because obviously these numbers are so scary. But I'm going to be honest with you. We've been using these same numbers for 4 years now. And it is a slow process. I already talked about how sometimes the church can be slow when they're making their decisions. And it has been a much slow. We assumed that we could just roll in and say, did you know there are 107,000 people dying of addiction? It's time to do something. And yet we still are using that same number to try to drum up that same level of excitement for that opportunity to help people in a brand new way. And yet we still find ourselves hoping that those next couple of churches will be the ones to really hear that message, take it, and run. We're starting to see some movement in it, but definitely not to the scale that we know it's going to take. We talk about 107,000 people dying, in the country of addiction. But even within Tennessee, we're still talking about a huge number of people. Just in the counties of Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia that we've worked with, there are over 2,300 churches. 2,300 churches. If each one of those churches would help even one person, we would be making a huge dent in this problem. We'd be making a huge difference in the lives, for sure, of that individual person. And just imagine what that would look like if you had now all of these people who are finding community, finding connection because the church is so motivated to do something about it. We know that the church can get motivated and can immediately equip itself to go out. I know of many area churches who've come together around this idea of adopting a whole street of houses in a town to help rebuild and reconnect those families and get them back on their feet because they lost everything. That's amazing. They were able to organize that with many churches taking on many different needs seemingly overnight. We're wanting to see that same level of urgency in the church for this crisis as well, because this has been going on since before this last hurricane, and it will continue to go on after the disaster that comes next. Not saying we shouldn't respond to these acute events, but we have to recognize that because we have these chronic events that are ongoing, there's constantly a need for us to step up and address it in some sort of meaningful way. So that's what we're talking about here. But now that leads us to asking the question, why hasn't anything changed? So why has the church at this point not yet responded in the way that we envisioned when we started this organization? We're like I said, we're going to go in, we're going to talk to them. They're going to be so ready to go, and they're going to follow us, and we're going to go make a huge difference. We're going to go to each of these 2,300 churches, and by the end of next year, 2,300 new people are going to be being ministered to by the church. Their lives are going to be changed, and that still hasn't happened, right? So what are some of the reasons that we have observed that are going on? Because again, if we're going to talk about the what we're seeing is there's a problem. What we're seeing is the church can respond. What we're seeing is the church hasn't responded. Why? What's going on underneath the surface? What are some of the reasons that people do or do not do things? That's really what we're trying to ask, because we believe that people are going to do things for reasons. They're motivated by something that's happened in their lives. They're motivated by something that's preventing them from taking that next step, whatever it may be. So as we've kind of observed the way that our interactions with different churches have worked, there's a couple of different reasons that I believe the churches are being held back from really stepping out and taking that leap and really diving into this ministry to people who are trying to find recovery and then ultimately live lives of flourishing. The first one is that the hurricane response was a tangible response. It's really easy to say, there is a tree across somebody's driveway. I have a chainsaw. I can remove that tree. It's one thing to say, I can see that this house is down, this window is broken out. I can go patch up or replace that window. This person doesn't have access to running water right now. I can go and buy a case of water, and I can take them that case of water, and they will have the water that they need for the next foreseeable future. It's a tangible thing that people can respond to. It's something that I can say, I can do it, and then I will be done with it, which brings me to my next thing. This was a temporary thing. Now, again, we talked about there are going to be long-term ongoing effects. There are still roads being rebuilt. There's still power being rerun. There's still people's houses being put back together. I'm not trying to say that immediately after the response happened, everything was fine and everything's good and we're back to normal. For some people, their lives will never be back to normal. We talked about people that are having to leave their towns entirely because they're unable to rebuild what they had before, and they need to find a new community and essentially start fresh. But for the people that are responding, it's really easy to say, I can go remove that tree on this day. I have time for that before I have to go back to my job or go back to work or to go back to this other thing that I have on my schedule. We can schedule a thing, we can set a start time, and we can set a stop time. Same thing with listening to this podcast. You can listen to this podcast because you say, this podcast is going to last for 30 minutes. I can start this podcast and I can finish this podcast in 30 minutes. Some of you will probably even say, I can listen to this podcast at times and a half speed and I'll be done in 20. But I can take that on because I know it's not going to have any longer lasting call on me. So we have a tangible thing, something that I can see, something that I can put my hands on, something I can really understand, and something that's temporary. And with addiction, that's not the case. We can't always see what's going on with addiction. We can train ourselves to look for signs, but we're not always going to understand what all is going on. We're not going to always see that somebody who has been in recovery has fallen back into a relapse. Or we can't see that somebody is having issues with their family at home because we're not around them in some sort of way. So we can't see all of those things. Or maybe we don't really understand what addiction looks like. Addiction doesn't have a particular appearance always. We can't just see the problem and then immediately fix it. There's no quick fix. There's no one thing that we can do. Some people would say that there's, a pill that we can give you, but that may not be the case for helping somebody actually live a long-term life of flourishing beyond that situation. And also, if you've been to any of our trainings, one of the things that we talk about when you get into recovery ministry is it is an ongoing process. It's not going to stop immediately. There's no, I have ridden in on my white steed and I have told you the things that you need to do with your life. You are healed and I'm going back to the house. Recovery ministry is hard. Recovery ministry is long lasting. It has its ups and downs. It's starts and stops. It's restarts, and it can be draining. It can be difficult. It can be challenging. We like to say it's hard, but it's worth it. And the thing that holds people back sometimes is they don't know when the off ramp is. If I get into this, how am I going to know when I get to get out? And for some of us, you may not. It may be that this is a lifetime kind of calling. Now, we'd also say you need to have enough people around you that you can step back and you can recover and you can recharge so that you can go that much more aggressively back into the ministry when you're kind of revitalized. But this kind of ministry, this isn't a call to an acute sort of solution. This is going to be something that is going to be ongoing. We're talking, again, hundreds of thousands of people over the last 5 years, and we're going to continue to see people that are in this. We're not going to solve this overnight, and it's going to be something that's going to take all of us being in it for a long time, in it for the long haul, if we really are going to make a difference. So one of the reasons that I think people were so excited to help with hurricane relief is it was tangible and it was temporary. But also, I think people saw people that were affected by the hurricane as innocent victims. And again, nobody caused the hurricane to take out their house. Nobody caused the hurricane to take away the power or to wash out the roads or to take away their access to food and water or communication. Nobody set themselves up for that. And I think because people have this perspective, especially with addiction, that these are people that have gotten themselves into this problem. This is their own fault. It's not as much on me to desire to step in and do something about it. in the same way that people viewed people who had been affected by the hurricane. It's easy to say they were innocent victims. They didn't do this to themselves. I need to step in and I need to help. I need to do something for them now. And while it's true that there is a lot more responsibility placed on people who are in addiction, if you've been to any of our trainings, we've talked about people do things for reasons, and sometimes those reasons are things that happen to them that were outside of their control. Not absolving people of the guilt of sin, not trying to say that people don't have responsibility for their own actions, but to so quickly say these people are innocent and these people are not, therefore I'm going to help the innocent people first, is to completely disregard all of the other factors that may be going on in individual people's lives that are facing struggles with addiction. And so we have to completely reshape the way that we view our approach to ministry and the relative guilt of people who are in whatever situation we're wanting to provide relief for. Because it's so easy for us to say, this is the easier one, this is temporary, it's tangible, I can see what it's going to be. These people are super innocent, they didn't do anything. Why wouldn't I help them first? This one seems harder, I can't really understand it, I don't know when it's going to end. They've gotten themselves into this situation. It's the same thing, and it should be motivated the same way. We should still want to serve, and we see how effective we can be. And then the last thing I think people see when they look at the hurricane is there's a little bit of a survivor's guilt, especially in this area. It could have been me. I could have been one of the ones who lost so much, and I didn't. And therefore, I feel like I owe it to people. But how is that any different from addiction and recovery? I've said this before. I have the personality type, and I've discovered it when I got my wisdom teeth out, just for a little personal story. I got my wisdom teeth out, and they, of course, give you those pain meds to help you kind of stave off the pain as you're coming off of everything. And I took the pain meds one night too many. I thought, I'm going to take these pain meds one more night just to see if I make sure I can get to sleep. And that night, instead of falling asleep and recovering, I realized very quickly, this is how people end up addicted to these things. Because I didn't go to sleep. I felt awake for the first time in a way. I really understood. I said, this is how easily somebody in my situation can fall into something like this. And so it could just as easily be us in any of these situations. So the reason that some people say it could have been me, I could have lost my house and I didn't, I feel guilty, I'm going to go help them. We should that same response is definitely true when we're talking about addiction and recovery as well. And I'm not trying to say that we should feel guilty that we're not addicted. I'm not trying to say we should feel guilty that our houses are standing where some people's are not. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to say these are the reasons, these are the underlying factors that below the surface stuff. This is what's going on, I think, in the hearts and the minds of the church when we talk about different ministry approaches, different responses to different crises. And so what I want us to do is not just say, wow, here's this one tangible thing, let's get to work, but rather step back and say, there's so much more that we can do. And to see this call, right? To see this thing that we've been presented before us, to have that desire to be for people, to see this astronomical number of people who are being affected by addiction, and to know that we as the church have the perfect opportunity, the perfect ability, the perfect answer. We have hope. Where there is no hope, we have a message of hope. We have community we're realizing more and more is just as effective or even more effective for helping people find and stay in recovery. So all of this to say, if we can understand what the problem is, I want us to not only look at this hurricane response. I'm not trying to make the point that we need to say, wow, we did this thing, it was bad that we did. No, it was great that we responded in the way we did. I'm jealous for that kind of response for the people that I know that are struggling with addiction and are trying to find recovery. And I know that the church is the most effective tool that's being completely underutilized societally for helping people find recovery. So what I'm trying to say is, let's look at what we've found that we can do. Let's see what we're capable of. And now let's look at these big numbers of people that are being affected by addiction. And let's say we can do this again. We can double down on our efforts. We can mobilize just as effectively. We can go as quickly as we did as if somebody's house was crashing down, because there are 100,000 people a year whose lives are crashing down around them. And if we're going to be the answer that we say we can be, if we're going to be the ones who are able to provide hope, we should do that right now.
This has been a podcast powered by Uplift Appalachia. To learn more, you can find us at upliftappalachia.org.